Good evening and welcome to episode 370 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zamantungwa Kumalo. It's a Tuesday edition of the Private Property Podcast. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the family. You're tuned into the leading property podcast in all things relating to property right here on the Private Property Podcast. And of course, do make sure that you share the love, share this live to your friends and family on your social media platforms so they can see what you are up to. And to our regular viewers on Facebook, on Instagram, or on YouTube, welcome to it. You know how we do. Every single weekday, you and I are in a conversation. We have an appointment where I'm always in conversation with a property expert who helps us make better property decisions. And it doesn't matter where you are in the property journey, this is certainly the place that you can come to help you when you make your decisions. And talking about making decisions and other great shows that you can find on Private Property's social media pages. It is a Tuesday. Balinoko will be bringing you the Farming Podcast later on at 8 p.m. And you can also catch her every single Thursday at the same time. Every Mondays and Fridays, Chad brings you the Home Shoppers Show, where he always takes you through incredible properties that you can find on www.privateproperty.co.za. And on Wednesdays, Esty Clarkson brings you the First Time Home Buyers Show, where she's always in conversation with people who've gone beyond buying that first property, but have grown their property portfolios from strength to strength. Well, those are the great shows every single weekday at 8 p.m. Remember, we are counting down to the Real Estate Industry Summit that is taking place later this week. And you can find out more details about the speakers, the lineup, and what you can expect for that incredible property event that's certainly going to deepen your property knowledge on realestateindustryssummit.co.za. And of course, there's myself, Zamantungwa Kumalo, taking you through your favorite property show every single weekday at 7 p.m. And this evening is going to be no different, of course. And before we get into our conversation this evening, as you would know, we're running an incredible competition where we're always giving away 500 rands in cash every single weekday. And all you have to do to stand a chance of walking away with that 500 rands is to make sure that you comment on the post that we have put up on our Facebook page, and you stand a chance of walking away with the cash prize. You have to be watching us live in order to claim your prize. Well, let's get started with our conversation this evening. I've got Sakhile Sebeko, who's an attorney and director at SM Sibeko Attorneys, and we're looking at all you need to know about a property sale transactions. Sakhile, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Good evening, Zama. Thank you for having me once more, and good evening to the viewers.
Thank you so much, Sakhile. So Sakhile and I were joking off air. We were saying that every time I have him on the show, I'm always traveling. I'm currently out of town. I'm in Durban, and I say to him, clearly he's my traveling lucky charm. So we must always book him regularly. Then I know that I will probably be traveling, because squeezing in travel is already difficult enough as it is. But Sakhile, I think let's get started with our conversation this evening. One of the things that we know about certainly looking at property sale transactions, and even when we buying or on the sell side, a lot of times we don't know what we don't know, and sometimes we just don't understand the full cycle of what is happening, and it can be so daunting. You've got your offer to purchase, you don't quite know what to look out for, and when we look at the sale transaction, and I think the first starting point is, of course, the offer to purchase. And at a high level, we talk about the offer to purchase quite regularly in the show. But just briefly, what are some of the key things you need to watch out for when we talk about that sale agreement as a buyer? Before you sign, what are just key things that need to be included in that offer to purchase?
All right, so Zama, to basically just have a basic sale agreement, there are 4 Ps that to talk about. And importantly, we'd have to have the property description, which is a property you're buying and or selling. Obviously, identify the parties. There should be a purchase price and payment terms. That is how you would be paying, if there's going to be a bond, how that bond would be secured, by when. And those would be just the basics that you'd have to just look out for. Everything else really would stand as generic, but those are the 4 important things. And obviously, if there are any suspensive conditions or resolutive conditions or any just conditions applicable to that agreement transaction.
And Sakhile, one of the things that we know typically happens in an offer to purchase, or can happen, is the disclosure section, where a seller can disclose things about the property. Perhaps share with us some of the things that can be inclusive in terms of a seller disclosing something, because I think sometimes people don't know what they don't know, and as far as some of those disclosures about a property or any property for that matter. And I think as a seller, what are the kinds of things that you should be disclosing about your property when you are selling it, and of course also about to sign that offer to purchase?
Okay, so generally when you talk of the disclosure, you'd look at the general condition of a property. So that would be any defects, any structural defects, damages, cracks on the wall, a leaking roof, if the gate is working, electrical issues, basically just the general condition of the property. But what you'd also want to disclose if you're aware of, if there are any servitudes on the property. And remember, a servitude is a limited real right over property. And your personal servitudes, you'd be talking of use of rights, which is someone X has got a right to use and enjoy this property, or a right to occupy the property. So very important, if there are any servitudes on the property, then they need to be disclosed. Typically on farms or bigger properties, sometimes ESCOM would have a servitude where there'll be, that have their those electrical cables, and the guys might need to drive in every now and then just to maintain such things. So those things are some of the disclosures that would have to be put forward.
Mm-hmm. And Sakhile, I think one of the big things when I even think about servitudes is more often than not, people don't even know about servitudes. And I'm now speaking particularly to people who will buy freestanding full title properties that aren't, for instance, in a gated community. So just as you're buying a property in a suburb or even a township, and you may not be aware of what the servitudes are. And we're seeing instances where sometimes people go to the extent of even building on top of, in areas where they shouldn't be building within the yard. And of course, we know the danger of that, right? That umasipala, when they need to access that servitude line, they know that they have the right of that space. They need to be able to access this and do whatever work that they do. And you would have essentially built it illegally, because if you had done an actual plan, we know it wouldn't have gotten approved, because the municipality would have told you that, listen, there's a servitude line running there, and we cannot be having you, building a double story or whatever kind of structure in that particular place. I think it really is one of those key things that people need to be aware of, especially if you are going to be, buying and building in areas where you think, I won't get, formal approval to build in this particular place. Or when you are buying and you know that your intention is to build, make sure that you're first aware whether there's going to be that restriction, because that's a restriction you can't sort of bypass or work around. I mean, other restrictions you can probably play around with, but not so much that one. Wouldn't you say, Sakhile?
You're correct. Look, there's been instances where municipalities have taken people to court and, in an order that the people need to then demolish the properties because, yes, you didn't build probably according to plan, or you've built on a municipal servitude. And typical servitude, typically we have those building lines always say stay 2 meters away from the wall. And you find that people normally, when you buy a property, when you have the plans drawn up, they comply. But when people then start building, it's always, let's just stretch it a bit. And the consequences of that is that when the municipality picks it up, yes, you'll be given the notice, but eventually they end up getting a court order which would say, look, you need to demolish, and this might be a very expensive structure or costly structure, and even demolishing it might affect the whole house. So very important for people to be aware of the servitudes and remain within the boundaries and respect the servitudes.
I am this evening in conversation with Sakhile Sebeko, an attorney and director at SM Sibeko Attorneys. And we're looking at what you need to know about property sale transactions right here on the Private Property Podcast with myself, Zamantungwa Kumalo. We're going to go for a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to certainly find out more about this. And I want to find out from you at home, what were some of the things that you learned when you were buying a property, and that really caught you by surprise. I know some of you, of course, have been watching the show for over a year, so there's quite a lot that you already know about, property sale transactions, and regardless of the property type that you are buying. But what are some of the things that you encountered that really did surprise you along your property journey? We're going to go for this quick break and see who the lucky winner is of that 500 rands in cash that is in the money bag, of course, for the competition that we're running on our Facebook page. We'll be back just after this.
Time flies.
down here below. And if you do, then the 500 Rand is all yours. And remember, if you want to be just like Utsulu, all you have to do is to comment on our Facebook page. We've got a pinned post where we want to find out all about the things that you have learned as you watch the show and the great advice that you'd like to share with the rest of the community. I am, of course, in conversation this evening with Sakhile Sebeko, who's an attorney and director at SM Sibeko Attorneys. We're looking at all you need to know about property sale transaction. And I want to find out from you at home, what were some of the things that you learned about as you were buying your property and really picked up along the way that you probably weren't aware of as you were navigating your property journey. Now, Sakhile, I think one of the things, and we've already touched on this, when we look at servitudes, that could easily be an area of dispute, especially if a buyer, for instance, wasn't aware of it and they buy and they had this big intention of potentially building where they're buying. But I'm keen to hear from you, what kind of disputes would you typically find when we look at people who are buying a property and suppose the property transaction either doesn't go through or there are issues along the way? And I know that sometimes the issues even have to do with disclosures, but what are some of the disputes that a buyer could potentially have with the seller when they're buying a property that they might even want to have or pick up a legal matter, let's say even after transfer, or want to make sure that transfer doesn't happen until these particular things are sorted out? So some of the common disputes that you've typically found between a buyer and a seller.
Okay. Zam, I'm not sure if I'm audible or see it's on mute.
No, we're not on mute. So we can hear you clearly. So you are indeed audible.
Okay. So some of the disputes that would have, typically you'll find that when a person buys, obviously with the purchase price, that there might be a suspensive condition of saying you must get, your final bond approval within X number of days, failing which obviously, if that condition is not met, then the transaction would then have to be cancelled. So you get certain disputes where a person buys a property, pays a deposit, and then, but there's a suspensive condition of that bond fulfillment. And you find that now when the bond has not been granted, the seller would not then want to reimburse the purchaser. And that always raises a concern. Sometimes you'd also deal with a property where disclosures or there's been misrepresentations with the disclosures, and just before the transfer you actually realize that this was not disclosed, and it's a big issue. There's a big crack in the wall, or the person just tried to hide it with paint or something like that. That also would then be grounds for dispute. And basically just people not fulfilling the conditions of the contracts, either before or after, would also raise a dispute. And how those disputes would then be dealt with, typically you'd end up having both parties consulting their attorneys, and normally would lead to litigation if the parties cannot then settle.
And I think that's such an important thing, Sakhile, that you want to make sure that suspensive conditions are going to be met, because I think sometimes people don't realize just how important that is. And as a buyer on your end, go the extra mile of stipulating things around, for instance, the suspensive condition that we all know is, of course, that finance is secured, but be explicit with that particular clause in that, a bank, for instance, providing 80% of the bond amount that you want. The seller could argue, well, that's been met, you must raise the other 20%. So you need to specify that you'd want it at 100%, and you can even say the kind of rate that you'd want, right? So if the bank gives you to you at 100%, but you actually get prime plus 3, you would have met the suspensive condition of the finance being secured. But of course, nobody's going to be happy with a rate of prime plus 3. So almost stipulate that it must be, at max, let's say prime plus 1 and below. So if you're going to go and get, prime plus 2, then that you essentially wouldn't have met that suspensive condition and you're able to no longer continue with that transaction. I think that is something that so many of us tend to not be aware of very early on, and of course don't know to put it in to safeguard ourselves to needing to then go ahead with the transaction that we may no longer want to, or of course having to pay the penalties because they would argue, well, these have been met. You didn't say that you wanted a particular rate. So if you then go and don't follow through with the transaction, then of course as the buyer, you would be at fault. And whatever the penalties are, you'd very likely be liable to pay them. So those are some of the key things that you absolutely need to be aware of. Now, Sakhile, I think one of the things I want us to look at, and we're even talking about it off air, is when, of course, the property that you are staying in gets sold. And I know that some lease agreements, of course, have the provision of sort of having the first right of approval. Perhaps just talk to us, through that. And I'm thinking of people, for instance, who live in certain properties for an extended period of time and would rather, if, a seller wanted to, of course, sell, would be comfortable buying that property instead of having to uproot the family and get a different kind of place. When we talk about that first right of approval for people who are living in a property that is going to be on sale or is now on sale, what exactly are we talking about?
Okay, so here you're talking about the right of first refusal, but which is not an automatic right. It would have to be contained in your lease agreement that we are renting this property, and should the property be put on the market, then you like or you reserve the right of first refusal, which would mean that you would be then granted or given the opportunity of purchasing that property first. And obviously, should you not wish to proceed or should that deal fall through, then the seller can then put the property on the market. But also, just something to touch on is in Afrikaans, it's a principle that's meaning if you're a tenant in a property and that property happens to get sold, it should not affect your lease. So you should still be able to proceed with your lease, and what would happen is that lease would then bind the new owner. Some people have had instances where you're renting a property, your lease period has not come to an end yet, and the owner decides to sell the property. Yes, they may approach you first, and in which case maybe you decide, no, I'm not going to proceed, and then someone else buys the property, and you find that the person that then buys the property would then say, look, this is my property and I want you off, and your lease agreement would still be valid. So it's very important that even purchases, when you're buying a property and there are tenants there, make sure to find out when that contract would come to an end so that you can apply your mind accordingly. But always keep in mind that when you do buy the property, it's going to come with tenants.
Mm-hmm. We are taking your questions and comments this evening on the Private Property Podcast with myself, Zamantungwa Kumalo, as we look at what you need to know about property sale transactions. Christine Dichaba on our Facebook page asking, what's the final stage before lodging? Can the conveyancer lodge while there are still outstanding documents from the municipality?
Okay, so the documents let me just run through the conveyancing process. So remember, the two parties then conclude and they have an agreement which is signed. Also important is that before you sign the agreement, each party would always you do have a right to refer that unsigned documents to your attorney, have your attorney go through the documents and check the provisions and just see if it's legally sound, and if it will cover you. Thereafter, the documents or the sale agreements would then be handed over to the conveyancer. And with the conveyancer, the prerogative of nominating the conveyancer lies with the seller because it's the seller's property. So the process for the conveyancer would be to make sure that all conditions have been met. If there are servitudes, that everything basically legally and technical has been brought to the attention of both parties. The purchase price has been secured. If there's a bond, that the financial implications have been attended to properly. And what's also important is that the conveyancer needs to get the rates clearance certificates from the municipality. So to answer the viewer's question, no, you cannot proceed to lodge unless you've got all documentation, because even when you do lodge without having those documents in place, your documents at the deeds office would then get rejected, for lack of having X documents included, your transfer duty receipt or your rates clearance certificate. If it's in an estate, you need to do it, the homeowners association, your body corporate, all of those things. So you need to have all of your certificates and documents in place, electrical compliance certificates, and all your applicable certificates.
Another question we've got here is coming through. I'm not quite seeing who's asking us the question, but the question is, what happens if a deal passes through the property and the property is transferred, but you find the property in a state that is worse than when you viewed it? So what happens there? You viewed the property, you make, you sign the OTP, and we rarely go back, as the matter is kind of being updated as the weeks go by. And suppose 3 months later, it's finally transferred and you take occupation, and when you go to it, you realize that it's not in the same state as when you had initially viewed it.
So remember, this is when you bought the property, the expectation is that it should be delivered to you in the state that you bought it in. So if the property has then been dilapidated and it's been ruined structurally, and so then the onus really is on the seller to make sure that he delivers what he sold. There have been instances where a person buys a property, you see a property today, you sign all the paperwork, and then you disappear. And then the next time you visit the properties after registration, and monies have exchanged hands and all that, and really to get the person to go back and fix, to say this is not what I saw, or this and this has now been changed. And to get the people to comply becomes a bit of a mission. But this is why then we talk of a disclosure. There would be that disclosure form in which all the checks you'd see, look, there are no cracks on the wall. So everything, it's like a checklist that you tick. And obviously, if at the end of the day you've been delivered something which is contrary to what you signed for in the disclosure, then you'd have to bring it to the attention of the attorneys. And in hopes, not really hopes, but then that's how you then have to address it.
Okay. No, and I think Sakhile, that's such a key one, that when you then are viewing that property, we always say try to view it more than once. So the first time would have been, okay, now you're kind of happy with it, because we also know the first time you viewed, you're not looking at all the taps working, are there any cracks, or all sorts of things. The moment you want to make an offer and you want to sign on the dotted line, ask the estate agent to go see the property again. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And now you're going with the view of, I know I want to buy this property. What are some of the things that I can possibly see that are wrong, so that by the time that offer to purchase comes, you're able to also effectively list them, especially if, for instance, the seller has not disclosed any of them, so that you try and minimize finding yourself in a situation like this as much as possible. Because the reality is, so many of us view it once and then you sign. And we know that one viewing, for the most part, simply isn't sufficient, especially considering how much of a big responsibility that you're taking on with the property. Sakhile, any final tip before we let you go for our viewers at home when it comes to property sale transactions?
I think it's just to echo what you said, that view the property more than once. If possible, avoid going to viewings in the evening. Rather do it during the day where you can see properly. Before you sign the contract, have a legal person, have your attorney go through it, have them explain to you all the different clauses and just the implications of entering into or concluding that agreement, and then you can then proceed.
And that's exactly where we're going to leave it at this evening, Sakhile. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's always such a pleasure to have you on the Private Property Podcast.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the views.
And that is Sakhile Sebeko, who's an attorney and director at SM Sibeko Attorneys. Wrapping up the Tuesday edition of the Private Property Podcast with myself, Zamantungwa Kumalo. It seems Utulu Semenya is not watching and is not being able to claim the prize. And so we have a rollover tomorrow evening. 1,000 rands is in the money bag. Make sure that if you've entered, you watch us live so you can claim the prize. Well, that's it from myself, Zamantungwa Kumalo. I'll be back on your screens tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Until then, do stay tuned for Mbali Nog at 8 p.m. And of course, stay home and stay safe.